Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend, and we're going to spend some time today, as we always do, talking about a variety of different topics. Let me first of all, as a program note, mention that about a half an hour from now, we'll have Lila Rose with us. Her book, Fighting for Life, is all about the issue of abortion, and you may have heard, if not, you're hearing it first here, that the Supreme Court has decided to take a case out of Mississippi, and it's the first abortion case that the Supreme Court has considered for some time. And of course, you have a much different court, especially with people like Amy Coney Barrett on the court. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about her book and talking about a lot of the issues of life. Next hour, we'll get into a conversation for a while with Gary Bauer on the tensions in Israel and some of the things happening with Hamas. Matter of fact, one of the articles I have posted here we'll talk about before he joins us. And in between that time, I wanted to cover many of these other very important stories that we have posted on our website, which is pointofview.net. Let me work through those because I have about a half an hour before we go to Lila Rose. Then have another half an hour with Gary Bauer, and then we'll have a final half hour before these 2 hours are up to cover some other topics, and most importantly, take your phone calls. But if I say something in the next half hour that you would like to comment on, or if something that either Lila Rose or Gary Bauer says that you'd like to make a comment on, we certainly welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. First article here is one that surfaced as a result of one of the talking head shows this weekend. You might remember the former Secretary of State is Mike Pompeo. This is an individual that has served in Congress, been the head of the CIA, and has been in the State Department. Has access to a lot of information you and I do not have access to. And so when he was on Fox News Sunday Morning Futures, he actually went into some detail describing what he called staggering links to which China went to cover up the suspected origins of this coronavirus pandemic that has destroyed the lives of so many individuals, killed so many people, and certainly upset everything. He says, I haven't seen a shred of evidence that suggests to the contrary. The evidence continues to accumulate that despite the fact that the Chinese Communist Party would not allow anyone to have access to the laboratory, the original materials, the doctors that were working there, the list of cover-up efforts, he says, is staggering, and the combination of the circumstantial evidence that we have combined with the intense effort to deny this information about the lab suggests to me strongly that this is where it originated. So he's using some inferences there, and you might say, well, okay, he's not a virologist. Well, I think we've already talked about on this program over the last week or so the fact that we do have individuals that have pretty good academic credentials in terms of science. Let's take one that I mentioned last week, and that's Nicholas Wade. You might say, okay, who is he? Well, he actually spent 40 years as the science editor for New York Times, and he wrote a piece that came out recently called The Origin of COVID Following the Rules, and he dismisses the attempt to say that this idea that the pandemic and the virus came from the Wuhan Institute for Virology, and to simply dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. Says, no, we have pretty good evidence actually that suggests that indeed it may have come from there, and then even takes on the fact that there were some that actually condemned the idea that this could even be nothing more than a conspiracy theory by, for example, Lancet, which is a very prestigious medical journal out of London, but again points out that the individuals that actually organized this, that would be Peter Daszak, the president of EcoHealth, who was actually investing in that. Of course, there's been real back and forth over the last week about whether or not the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases actually funded that indirectly. And you might remember who the head of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases are. That would be Dr. Anthony Fauci. But in addition to some of the comments being made by these various medical individuals, some who have better academic credentials than others, some have more medical credentials than others, I did not have a chance to mention last week, but it's worth mentioning as well, well that there was a letter that was published in Science magazine, which is kind of the preeminent science magazine and journal for the United States, in which you had 18 scientists who called for an investigation into the origins of the pandemic. They actually said, quote, theories of accidental release from a lab and zoonotic spillover both remain viable. And then they went on to say, quote, knowing how COVID-19 emerged is critical for informing global strategies to mitigate the risk of future outbreaks. So if nothing else, what was labeled not so long ago as a conspiracy theory now has a lot more credibility and credence, and something that I think is going to be investigated for quite some time. And another one that isn't necessarily a conspiracy theory set aside, but an interesting side note to that is you might remember when some people were asking, for example, is it possible that there would be some kind of chip placed in the vaccines? And of course, we asked individuals about that and they dismissed it. But in something that parallels this, I don't know if you saw this, came out the other day. It's in kind of some of the tech magazines, but nevertheless, you now have in the Defense Department a team at the Pentagon have actually been working on a chip that could be implanted in the body that would help detect something like COVID-19. So that doesn't mean they actually have put that in the vaccine, but, you know, even the things that are just dismissed, I think, out of hand as conspiracy theories, you come back and say, well, maybe it wasn't so far afield after that. And again, if you haven't heard that covered in the mainstream press, well, I think you probably know why that is the case. Let's, if we can, before and then after the break, talk about the whole issue of the Middle East right now. One of the articles I've posted comes from the Wall Street Journal. It's entitled Israel, Hamas, Iran, and Biden. Now, we will get into that in more detail with Gary Bauer. As a matter of fact, we have posted some of his best pieces that came out of his end-of-day report. I've kind of jokingly referred to those as the best hits of Gary Bauer. But nevertheless, our friends at the Wall Street Journal said that the latest war between Hamas and Israel enters into a second week. They said the narrative is pretty much the same script. Hamas fires rockets into Israeli cities. Israel retaliates by bombing the source of the rockets in Gaza. Hamas plays up civilian casualties, and the world then pressures Israel, I should say, to stop defending itself. We'll get to Iran in just a minute. And if nothing else, they go on to say this has been a pattern and a tried and true narrative for literally years, probably decades. And they conclude, let's hope that this isn't the trap the Biden administration falls into as the fighting continues. So far, the White House has supported Israel's right to self-defense, but the weekend bombing of a building in Gaza that housed media offices, including reporters from the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, have led to outrage and admonition. So I want to get back to that after the break and address that particular issue as well. And then just before we run out of time in this half hour, I want to talk about this issue of inflation. I have two articles, but one in particular which I've posted by our good friend Dr. Ben Carson, and a very articulate piece. We want to talk about that as well. So we have a lot to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I doubt that the CEOs of major corporations travel in the same circles as I travel. If they did, they would hear the phrase, get woke, go broke. It appears that a majority of Americans have had enough from the woke corporate culture. But even if they don't pay attention to what many of their consumers are saying to each other and on social media, you would think that they would pay some attention to prominent political figures. Senator Rick Scott wrote an open letter to woke corporate America. He hoped that they were having fun with their virtual signaling and their attempts to one-up each other in trying to show how woke they'd become. He observed that you must have loved the accolades from your elitist left-wing peers when you took the All-Star game from Georgia. He also added, never mind that you destroyed working people's jobs and hurt people who haven't worked since COVID-19 took a member of their family or destroyed their small business. The CEOs might have even seen a Wall Street Journal op-ed by Senator Ted Cruz, if for no other reason than the criticism the senator received for writing it. He predicted that many members of Congress won't look the other way on Coca-Cola's $12 billion in back taxes owed, this time when Major League Baseball lobbies to preserve its multi-billion-dollar antitrust exemption will say no thank you. They might even have seen the latest survey that discovered that more than a third of American adults said that they were less likely to purchase Coca-Cola products. In fact, a majority of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats said that they were less likely to purchase Coca-Cola products. Most of us merely want corporations to focus their attention on developing superior products and services. But stay out of the culture wars and stop trying to be more woke than your competitors. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take our first phone call in Georgia, WLPE. Fran, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for taking my call. I've just wanted to have something said about the gain function on the virus because I read what it was this morning and it scared me.
And again, what they are doing is to actually increase the ability, for example, of a virus to cross from one species, maybe a bat species, to a human or something like that. It's called gain of function. Now, I thought it was kind of interesting, even though Senator Rand Paul is a doctor, and you'd figure he would come up with a like a technical term. I love the fact that he says what they're trying to do is juice up the virus. Okay, so that's what it is. But let me read something. This came from some of the work that was done at the Wall Street Journal in which they documented this, and they pulled this quote from some of the research that was done, which I quoted just a minute ago by Nicholas Wade. And he says what was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology was doing what are called gain of function experiments, which are designed to make coronaviruses infect human cells. And what they do is they first do this with humanized mice. Now, again, using a technique called recombinant DNA research and gene splicing, we won't get into all the technical details. These mice have parts of human DNA, so they're not experimenting on humans, although I hate to think they probably are doing something like that somewhere, maybe in China, but they're working on what are called humanized mice so that they can then take some of these viruses that would either not infect a human being or not infect them in a significant way. And this is the kind of experiment that has been done in the past with what is called SARS-2, because this is a SARS-2-like virus. I don't want to go too much down the rabbit trail here in terms of, or get into the deep weeds, but nevertheless, then what you have are the researchers, it says, were not vaccinated against the viruses under study, and they were working in a minimum safety conditions of a BSL-2 laboratory. I've had some people derisively say that that is the kind of safety protocol you'd find in a dentist office. If indeed that is accurate, and again, I don't have enough expertise to know if it is, then as Nicholas Wade points out, the escape of a virus probably could have indeed happened. It could have broken out on the doorstep of the Wuhan Institute and then began to pass from there elsewhere. Now, Fran, the point I'm making is that you might say, well, again, we shouldn't be surprised that all this dangerous kind of research is being done in China, until I hear Senator Rand Paul say that as best he can determine, there's 11 facilities here in the United States where some of this gain of function research is being done. And that's why, even though we had people initially just dismiss the idea that this virus came from the Wuhan Institute, but instead came from a pangolin or a bat in these wet markets, I think it illustrates, again, one of the real concerns with some of the kind of genetic engineering that has been taking place in China and maybe even here in the United States.
Yeah. Yes.
So if you're concerned, I'm concerned as well. So appreciate your call, and we'll get into a couple more calls if you want to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I hope that wasn't too technical, but the point I'm making is gain of function experiments have been done in a sense to actually have the ability for viruses to cross a particular species line. And as a result of that, you might look at that and say, well, that's just because they're doing basic research. And then if you're looking at China, you might say, yeah, but were they also hoping to develop a biological weapon? I don't know. I'm not going to extrapolate by that, but I simply say that what we are dealing with right now are a number of people that are coming out saying, you know, when it was dismissed out of hand, really back in February, before we knew anything, that this couldn't possibly have come from the virus could not have possibly come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You're now starting to see some people with some pretty good academic credentials saying, no, it's quite possible it did. And if anything, when we look at some of the various genomes and we look at the sequencing, I quoted from David Baltimore the other day, for example, Nobel Prize winner, who's saying, yeah, it looked like that to me, then you have, I think, a level of investigation. Will we ever be able to prove that China was negligent? Will we ever be able to actually get any kind of reparations for China for what they've unleashed on the rest of the world? Well, we know the answer to that, but still, I think it's worth pursuing after it was pretty much shut down this time a year ago. Now I think we know a lot more, and that's why these people are asking those questions, and that's why I made it the first article we've posted on the website. Let's get back to the second article before we run out of time, and that is I've also posted this very good piece that comes from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and Biden. And again, Israel has been criticized because, after all, they actually attacked a building where there were terrorists, but it was also a building where there were journalists. Now, again, I'll quote first from the editorial that appeared in the Wall Street Journal that you can read in its entirety on our website, pointofview.net. Then I'm going to quote from something else that comes from a secondary source. But they did say that Israel did warn the journalists and others in the building to clear out an hour before the attack. They did so, and that's why there's no reports of casualties. They also let Hamas militants escape because of that, which is unfortunate because they wanted to take them out as well. And there are going to be mistakes in war. There are going to be civilians that die. But the point is that if nothing else, they were concerned not only about a conflict that was started by Hamas, but also by another radical organization, which is called Islamic Jihad. Now, you can read all of that is our second article we've posted today on the website. But I have a secondary one that comes as well. This appeared in the Jerusalem Post, in which Israel, quote, shared intelligence with the U.S. showing how Hamas operated inside the same building with the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. As we pointed out before, not surprising because oftentimes they also have terrorist groups that even try to launch these rockets from the top of schools, hospitals, buildings where there's civilians in order to even try to maximize the casualties. And the outcry that has come from some of the people in journalism, because after all, you should never attack a journalist's office Well, yeah, but if your office is in with Hamas and other terrorists, guess what's going to happen? And I love one of the IDF spokespersons. This was the Brigadier General Hidey Zilberman. He said, I want to see what would happen if one rocket were fired on Washington. They are firing salvos towards civilian populations. We're in the midst of an operation. If Hamas and some of these other groups think that they can hide behind the media, their buildings are not something they can hide behind. And so, again, as much as we would lament the fact that there has been, in some cases, a very significant attack on a building where there were people of the Associated Press and also Al Jazeera, at the same time, that was done intentionally so that they could generate the outrage, which, of course, is taking place all over the country. We may get to this in the next hour in more detail, but I did want to mention that I've posted a very good piece by Dr. Ben Carson. And even though he is an individual that has been focusing his time and attention on housing and urban development, reminds us that we are in the midst of also an inflation crisis. Let's see, we have a crisis at the border. We have a crisis in the Middle East. We have all sorts of pieces of legislation that could really, in a very significant way, negatively affect our election and our society. And we're overspending an incredible amount of money. And Dr. Ben Carson says, you know what? We also have an inflation crisis because he says, here's the price we pay if we don't get spending under control. And reminds us that, and we'll talk more about this maybe in the next hour, that there has been a substantial spike in federal spending. You think? His estimate is, and I think it's accurate, that we have spent $8.5 trillion. That's, he says, $8.5 million just in the last 4 quarters, and actually twice exceeded $10 trillion in a quarter. And so he's talking about just the incredible amount of money that is being spent right now and the obvious implication that this has in terms of inflation, how it's changed our consumer price index, and a great deal more. So again, we will get into that in a little more detail. It's the third article we've posted, which we'll get to. But when we come back, we want to talk about this issue of abortion. A very good book that's come out by Lila Rose on fighting for life. We can learn how she came to be a pro-life activist at a very young age, I might add, as well. And then also get her thoughts about the Supreme Court decision to actually hear a major abortion case. So all of that coming down today. Next hour, we'll have Gary Bauer with us. We'll come back to the tensions in the Middle East. Also, we have yet to even talk about the influence of Iran in all of this. So we have a lot to cover, and we will do all of that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that, again, the Supreme Court has decided that they will indeed hear a major abortion case. And one of the things we'll be talking about with our friend Lila Rose is even today she has issued a press statement saying this is the most important abortion-related case in a very long time. We are long overdue for the Supreme Court to revisit Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey decisions that have led to the death of over 60 million innocent children and led many women and men to lifelong regret. She goes on and talks about some other aspects of that, and we'll get into that conversation with her today. We had already planned to cover the very important book that is coming out, Fighting for Life, Becoming a Force for Change in a Wounded World, and certainly today it fits very well with this decision by the Supreme Court to consider this issue of abortion. Lila Rose has been on the program with us many times before. It may have even been, I think, the first time we interviewed when she was a UCLA student, but certainly shortly thereafter, speaker, writer, human rights activist, founded and serves as president of Live Action. She's also the host of the podcast, The Lila Rose Show. We have information about her on our website today, and we also have information about her book, which has just come out this month, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it either in hardcover or Kindle. And Lila Rose, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be back.
I think you are a great illustration of the power of one individual. Of course, we've followed you for many years, and I learned a little bit more about when you first learned about abortion, reading the handbook on abortion by certainly Dr. Wilkie, who's been on the program with us in the past with Marlon Maddox and myself and Penna Dexter, and then even your involvement there at UCLA. But before we get into the book, this is significant because, as you point out in one of the press releases that just came out, this is an opportunity for the Supreme Court to get the science right. You always hear it about trust the science here and recognize that we're dealing with a human life inside the womb. But what are your thoughts about this possible decision that may in the future come down from the Supreme Court?
Well, I think that it's crystal clear that the states have the right to protect children in their jurisdiction. I mean, Mississippi banning abortions after 15 weeks is a no-brainer. I mean, they should be protecting all children, whether they're younger than 15 weeks or not. But I think it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does here. I mean, we have justices who appear to be more conservative, who seem to be more sympathetic to the fundamental human right, which is the right to life. They're sometimes called originalist justices, meaning they would want to protect the original intentions of the founding fathers in drafting the Constitution. And of course, the Constitution includes the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection of the law for all people and says that no state has the right to deprive anyone of their right to live. That should, of course, extend to all humans, including preborn children. So I'm hopeful that the court will rule in a way that gets us closer to completely undoing the precedent of Roe v. Wade. I mean, at this point, the truth is very few people even know. I mean, legal experts, the justices on the court right now, of those that are on the court, they could even agree on what is the precedent that Roe set, because since then it's gotten more and more murky to people to see that, you know, the child, it's very clear the humanity of the child begins at fertilization. That's when a unique individual life begins. So the whole foundation for legal abortion in America is very weak. It's been crumbling for a long time, and I hope to see the court make a very definitive step towards legal protection for the preborn and how they rule on this case.
Let me just mention we have lots of information on this today on the website. We also have a link to the Lila Rose Show, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and of course the book Fighting for Life. But just before we get off of that, let me just mention real quickly that what Mississippi is asking the justices to do is review the, if you will, viability standard, arguing that the rule prevents states from defending maternal health and And the Attorney General, Lynn Fitch, says it is well past time for the court to revisit the wisdom of the viability bright line rule. So we'll focus some time and attention on that in the future, but I did want to at least take a little bit of time to talk about your book. And I mentioned just a minute ago that certainly one of the individuals we used to have on the program, Marlon Maddox, interviewed the author of the handbook on abortion, Dr. Wilkie. And in some respects, I did not know till I read your book that you found it on a lower shelf and a paperback area, began to read that, and that was at least one of the things that caused you to begin to think about this issue of abortion and pro-life.
It was. I mean, that book was inspirational for me because it actually showed and described what happens to that preborn child in an abortion. So in the first trimester, and we're talking about the 15-week ban that Mississippi is trying to do to protect children after 15 weeks. But before 15 weeks, I remember seeing as a young girl an image of a child who was 10 weeks old in the first trimester, who had arms and legs and a face. You can see the humanity of this baby. At just 3.5 weeks, the heart is beating. By 6 weeks, there are brain waves that can be detected. I mean, the child's development is rapid. And when I saw for the first time the violence that abortion did to a 10-week-old baby, there was an image of a child who was the victim of a suction abortion procedure in that handbook that you just mentioned. I was heartbroken. And I talk about this in my book, Fighting for Life, how heartbreak, awareness of the evil, becoming aware of that there's evil in the world, that there is this violence against the vulnerable, and it's legal. It's upheld by the law. That heartbreak and that awareness was what initially spurred me to action, to start Live Action as a teenager, and since then to grow it to the global organization we are today.
Let me just mention, too, that, of course, you will want to read this to just learn a little bit more about the story of Lila Rose, but she's written it in such a way that if you want to be involved in any kind of activity, it could be a pro-life activity, it could be the issue of human trafficking, it could be a variety of others. You have a whole section on getting started, know your gifts, know your worth, and the rest, overcoming, prepare to stand alone, build a team, all the way to coming home. And so there's just a lot of, if you will, general principles that people can apply, whether they're in the pro-life battle or another one. But again, I mentioned UCLA because that's another story that is a part of your history before we talk about how people can learn from your experience, because you find yourself as a freshman on campus, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I did find in, how many, 40,000 students, I guess it was, I did find some other pro-life people, and then you find out, well, actually, there's only 2 in this group, but that started the whole idea that we need to gather more and more people, and we need to do what we can to educate even first our fellow students and then ultimately the nation that you have done. And that really came from just that experience on a college campus.
Exactly. And it came when you first start getting passionate about a cause. And I talk about the Fighting for Life is, as you said, a manual. Whatever your cause is, these are the steps to take to fight for what you believe in, to find your calling in standing up for justice. And particularly in the pro-life fight, I think there's a sense that we may have where we're alone. We're concerned about abortion, but we feel like so many people are against us or they are apathetic. And what I discovered as a freshman on my college campus when I just started getting plugged in and learning about who was out there, there were other students who wanted to stand up for life, but they needed to be organized. We needed to stand up and take action. I think that was a big part of it, is don't just sit with our beliefs, but stand up and share these facts that we had, fetal development, the violence of abortion, the harm to women, start to make noise about it, because I think the injustice, the oppression, it thrives in silence. It thrives in inaction. And it takes us leaving our comfort zone, and I talk about this in Fighting for Life. You've got to leave your comfort zone. If you're going to stand up for an injustice, especially one that has been accepted by society, it's going to require a little bit of moving out of what's the normal mode for you, what's comfortable. And that's where other people can be so helpful, finding that one person who agrees with you, who can back you up, finding that one collaborator. And so I detail in my book how I did that and why anybody can do that in order to stand up to make the change that's so desperately needed.
Penna Dexter says, Kerby, one of the things you use is the pronoun problem, and that's something I developed years ago, because I'll hear of people calling in and say, what can I do? And I said, okay, pronoun problem. It's what can we do? In other words, you can join with like-minded organizations. It could be Eagle Forum, Concerned Women for America. It could be, of course, Live Action. It can be all sorts of different pro-life groups. It can be various kind of groups. Matter of fact, in the next hour, we'll be talking with our friend Gary Bauer, could be with American Vision or a variety of others. And so those are some of those key issues. And we need to take a break, but I might just mention that I see some great connections between your book and the Lila Rose show, because one of the chapters, matter of fact, the one that we just alluded to, Find Your Heroes. And I think your most recent podcast was Heroes and Anti-Heroes. So as we go to a break, let me first of all mention that if you would like to find this book, I suspect you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, because indeed it is just coming out, and it is published by Thomas Nelson, and should be able to find it very easily there. But if not, we have a link so that you can get it both in hardback or in Kindle. And we also have a link to the Lila Rose show, and you who don't have to remember how to type all that out, because we already have it there, and she's spent some time not only looking at the abortion issue, but a variety of other topics that we often address here on Point of View. So let's take a break. We'll come back and pull together just a few more key principles in Fighting for Life by Lila Rose. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with Lila Rose. Also, of course, Lila Spence, and she's married now, so either way is a way to address her. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. New book out, just came out earlier this month, Fighting for Life, Becoming a Force for Change in a Wounded World. And Lila, for just a minute, let's, if we can, pass some things on to some of our listeners, because whatever issue you may be involved with, the second section of your book really helps us understand, as you mentioned a minute ago, that you have to leave your comfort zone. I understand all that, and I think people understand that. But also, back to this idea of the pronoun problem, you have a whole chapter on build a team and find your rock, because there is a sense in which if you head out into the workaday world today, matter of fact, I even have a commentary coming out today on woke corporations. If you stand for biblical truth, if you stand for life, you stand for moral principles, very quickly you're going to feel like you're alone, and you're going to be attacked, and you're going to need a team, and you're going to need a rock, aren't you?
It's absolutely true. And the great news is this: there are so many people that we don't even realize often that actually agree with us, and the instinct that we have for morality, for biblical morality, for protecting basic human rights, for being opposed to abortion. I guarantee you that there is someone in your workplace who's skeptical of some of these ideological trends that are being pushed through, that are skeptical of very far left politics that are just presented as if that's the norm and that's what everyone should believe. So the more courage we have to speak up kindly but boldly, the more willing that we are to educate ourselves and then be voices for the truth, and not be pushed into silence by the forces around us, the more we will give courage to others. But in order to access that courage, because it's hard to speak when we feel we are alone, that's where it's so important, as you said, to have other people that we connect to who agree with us, who are on the same page. I talk a lot about the power of mentors in my book, and heroes, people that we look to inspire us, and people that can help guide us, because we're not made to do this alone. And you mentioned some great organizations last segment. Live Action has a lot of resources and programs for educating ourselves and plugging into the pro-life movement. There's a lot of other great pro-life groups. There's a lot of other great just conservative groups out there if you are a conservative. And so get plugged in. The more that we surround ourselves, even if it's through online connections, with people that are on the same wavelength, who see the truth that we see, the more courage that will give us to go out and make the difference we need to make.
One of the chapters, which I am so glad you included, is expect resistance from within. I think oftentimes I will meet individuals that have this vision and believe that God has directed them in a particular area, and they've got sort of starry-eyed, and they're just convinced that everybody's going to come alongside them, and they're never going to run into any difficulty. And you talk about that when you first started doing this whole idea of investigative journalism. We've covered that in the past, but we can talk about that in just a minute, just in case some of our younger listeners have never heard of that. You would just kind of assume that everybody was going to agree with your strategy, and you found out that wasn't necessarily the case, was it?
Well, it wasn't. Not only was it not the case, but I had people publicly come out at a time when I was investigating abortion clinics, showing the findings. Congress was doing actual, bills to defund the abortion industry in the wake of our investigations. And there were actual other pro-life leaders coming out and condemning our work and actively trying to, get us to go away, get our work to not exist anymore, and saying it was immoral and, other allegations. And so that's par for the course. I think that's, the more you get involved in your advocacy, your calling, standing up for a cause, there's going to be so many inflection points along the way. And there will come a moment when you go against some of your own people. I talk about building a team, but eventually some of the own people on your team, they may disagree. They may defect. They may take off and say, we oppose you now. And that's just human. And so when we are better prepared, we know that this is part of the territory of changing the world, that we're going to face those sorts of obstacles. It makes it, not that it makes it easier in the sense that it's still challenging, but it prepares us better for those battles. And so that's why I included those stories and lessons in Fighting for Life, because I wanted to provide, what does it look like to actually start out, go out there, get involved, make the difference, stand up for against an injustice that's popularized, so it's unpopular when you're standing up, and what are the obstacles you'll face along the way. Because when we remove surprises and we're better prepared, then we are able to better do the work that God is calling us to do.
Again, when I got the book, I was thinking, well, I'm going to have a lot of story about Lila Rose, and you certainly wove in a lot in there. But if I had a subtitle, I'd say a manual for political and cultural engagement, because you really help people understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the successes, the pitfalls, and all of it. So if nothing else, we can learn a lot of lessons vicariously from you, Lila. But let's take some phone calls along the way. I think some people want to comment, so we'll head to, in this case, South Carolina, WLPE. David, thank you for joining us today.
How you doing?
What would you like to add?
I just want to make a comment about how the religious aspect of abortion, because I actually think it started in the Old Testament with Asherah and the Molech and all them, because they all offered their children as sacrifices.
You know, I've traveled to Israel a number of times, Lila, and one time I went to a place where there had been an archaeological dig of where they were sacrificing the children, and it's such a somber place, but it's hard to not think that that has just been institutionalized through groups like Planned Parenthood and NARAL and others here in the United States.
I think you're right. I think you're spot on that today's abortion is modern child sacrifice. And we're not sacrificing children in abortion clinics to some pagan god. We're sacrificing our children to our own desire for convenience or to have the lifestyles we want or the bodily autonomy that we think is justifying the killing or whatever our reason is. That is the idol, and we're sacrificing the child. We're killing the child for the sake of that idol.
Let me just mention, we're getting close on time here, that first of all, we have a link to your Facebook page, a link to your Twitter page, also a link to the Lila Rose Show, which is a podcast. And I might just mention that people might think, well, it's always on abortion. Well, sometimes, but a lot of the other topics have to do with everything from marriage and culture and the coronavirus and just all sorts of other aspects of that as well. So in some respects, if people would like to get your podcast, we have a link to that. But if they would like to know more about Life Action and some of the things that are there, we've got all sorts of links, but talk about what they will find when they land either at Life Action or at the Lila Rose Show.
Thank you. Well, at Live Action, you'll find endless pro-life resources so you can be educated and equipped to stand up for life and how to get activated there. The Lila Rose Show is more worldview, so it's a lot of commentary on what does the culture of life look like, marriage, relationships, faith, family. So I hope you will tune in. We have a lot of great conversations and great experts on as well. And then Fighting for Life, as you said, is that manual. It's that manual for, I love you where you put it, social and political engagement, and really an inspirational guidebook for how we can each stand up to make the difference that God, I believe, is calling each one of us to make.
Again, Thomas Nelson, about 200 pages. There are 27 chapters, but it's broken down in, first of all, getting started, such things as find your heroes, know your gifts, know your worth. Then a whole section on overcoming, which we've already talked about a little bit. Leave your comfort zone, build a team, expose the evil, trust God, find your rock. And then finally, a section on coming home, some of the issues of embrace, mercy, learn to grieve, find your heart, and just some really great practical material from an individual that we have followed for so many years. And so, Lila, I've always appreciated the information that you've provided, the investigative journalism that you've done, and the motivation that you've always had, even since being a college student. So, if nothing else, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for sharing about the book, and hope that everyone enjoys it and is inspired and equipped by Fighting for Life.
You should be able to find it on our website. We've got it very easily available to find, so you can find it there, Fighting for Life, Lila Rose. We come back, going to change topics. Gary Bauer is going to be with us. We're going to be talking about what's happening in the Middle East. We've got a lot to cover today, and we'll try to cover some more of it right after these messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View radio talk show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we have Gary Bauer with us, as we've been advertising, because we thought it would be really good to get some of his perspective on what is happening there in the Middle East, and in particular Israel. As a program note, let me just mention we did post a very good piece from the Wall Street Journal, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and Biden, and so we can certainly point you there. But I did something we've never done before. I took what I thought were some of the best excerpts from Gary Bauer's end-of-day report. I've kind of jokingly called them, you know, the best hits from Gary Bauer, and posted those so that you can read those. Of course, we also have a link to the end-of-day report, which I've always said is must-reading. Gary Bauer, as you well know, served in the Reagan administration as the chief domestic policy advisor. Also, of course, is the president of American Values and chairman of the Campaign for Working Families. And Gary Bauer, hope you had a good weekend. I'm hoping some of the leaders in Hamas had a really bad weekend.
Well, Kerby, thank you for that really kind introduction, as always. I deeply appreciate all the support that you've given my work over the years, and the exposure you've given it to the many listeners that you have around the country. Yeah, my weekend was good. We had some family and got together to celebrate a couple of family birthdays and so forth, so that was very nice. But you're absolutely right. I kept one eye on the Middle East, and I don't feel it's unchristian at all to say that my hope was that the terrorists of Hamas and Hezbollah were having a very bad weekend as they attempted to rain missiles on the people of Israel. Missiles, by the way, as you well know, they don't even try to aim them at military targets. They consider all of Israel to be a military target, and they fire these missiles indiscriminately. So the 7 or 8 million Israeli Jews spent the last week heading for the bomb shelters that they're all required to have in their homes, and dodging missiles coming out of the air.
And again, we've even pointed out that some of those rockets that were fired actually landed in Gaza. So when you see some of these things being destroyed, that is because it's so indiscriminate. But one of the things I quoted was Israel under siege. You reminded us that when Donald Trump, the previous president, if anybody forgetting who he is, moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there was all sorts of arguments that there was going to be fighting in the streets, and none of the sorts actually took place. But now, because you had Jerusalem Day a week ago Sunday, you also had kind of the Night of Power Muslims. You have controversy over what is taking place right now in East Jerusalem and rockets being fired. We have a crisis in the Middle East, even though this administration doesn't seem to want to call it a crisis.
Yes, that's a good summary, Kerby. You know, I don't know what it is about free men and women, you know, whether it was the 1930s in England, people deceived themselves into thinking that you could appease the Nazis. And what we're dealing with in the Middle East is what I've called, I think you have too, Islamic fascism. It is a very radicalized form of the Islamic faith. It's not what the typical Muslim believes, but you've got these radical groups, including the entire government of Iran, which is radical Shia Muslims. and they are dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So as history teaches us, the only thing that works when you're dealing with fanatics like this is strength. I mean, that's just, whether people like it or not, that is what history proves. And so when, during the Trump years, the whole world saw a strong president that was not hesitant to hit back against enemies of the United States or enemies of Israel, who's our major ally in the region, we saw a decline in attacks on Israel and our interest in the Middle East. The embassy story you recounted is the perfect example. President after president, Republicans and Democrats, pledged they would move our embassy to the capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem, and then they would get into office and their knees would shake after the State Department and others would say, don't you dare do that. They tried that with Trump. He said, I made a promise, and he moved the embassy. And the world did not end. There weren't riots in the streets. A new war did not break out. But now that we have a president that's signaling in many ways weakness not only at our border, but weakness in the Middle East, suddenly the enemies of the United States and Israel are emboldened, and that is what has ended up leading to this conflict, and will lead, I'm convinced, to a larger war unless we get some backbone in the White House.
Well, again, if I can quote from you, one of the things you mentioned in the end of day report was stop appeasing Iran, and pointed out that you have about 40 different Republican senators that are saying, Mr. Biden, it's time to stop negotiating with Iran. But that's a concern, because I've had, even in my Sunday school class, people saying, don't the people in the State Department understand that there is a desire in Iran to have a second Holocaust? Don't they understand that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who right at the moment is not in power but running for re-election, believes that the Mahdi would actually protect them, so that if they launch nuclear missiles, assuming they get them someday, or maybe they have them, we don't know, against Israel, that the Mahdi will protect them from Israeli missiles. We are dealing with something we've never seen before. When you were in the Reagan White House, Ronald Reagan quite understood that mutually assured destruction worked, because Russia knew that if they fired missiles at us, we would fire them back at them, and that was a deterrent. But if you have people who say, and maybe even believe, that a Mahdi will actually protect them from Israeli missiles, you're dealing with a different kind of enemy we've never seen before.
Yes, that is exactly right. And one of the things that makes it hard for us to deal with that is that our foreign policy establishment and a lot of the people in the bureaucracy at the State Department, and sadly, even a lot of people that run the U.S. military or are embedded at the Pentagon, went to the same schools that we have seen teach so many crazy things in the last couple of decades. And they don't understand dealing with an enemy that is motivated by their religious faith. Now, of course, Christians are motivated by our religious faith, but to much different ends that make society better, ends that increase liberty and tolerance, etc. But when you're dealing with radical Islamists, either Sunni or Shia, you come up with the kind of thing we're seeing now, where you've got people running some of these governments that believe the one way they can ensure that they will be in heaven and rewarded for their life on earth is if they kill the infidel. And nobody is more of an infidel to these folks than the Jewish people. And, of course, as Americans, we should understand that they consider us the infidel also. They call Israel the little Satan. They call us the big Satan. And it is a worthless, pointless exercise to negotiate with people that have that worldview.
Gary Bauer with us. When we come back, we'll talk about how the left has responded to this and even how the press has responded to this. So we have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
doubt that the CEOs of major corporations travel in the same circles as I travel. If they did, they would hear the phrase, get woke, go broke. It appears that a majority of Americans have had enough from the woke corporate culture. But even if they don't pay attention to what many of their consumers are saying to each other and on social media, you would think that they would pay some attention to prominent political figures. Senator Rick Scott wrote an open letter to woke corporate America. He hoped that they were having fun with their virtual signaling and their attempts to one-up each other and trying to show how woke they'd become. He observed that you must have loved the accolades from your elitist left-wing peers when you took the All-Star game from Georgia. He also added, never mind that you destroyed working people's jobs and hurt people who haven't worked since COVID-19 took a member of their family or destroyed their small business. The CEOs might have even seen a Wall Street Journal op-ed by Senator Ted Cruz, if for no other reason than the criticism the senator received for writing it. He predicted that many members of Congress won't look the other way on Coca-Cola's $12 billion in back taxes owed, this time when Major League Baseball lobbies to preserve its multi-billion-dollar antitrust exemption will say no thank you. They might even have seen the latest Rasmussen survey that discovered that more than a third of American adults said that they were less likely to purchase Coca-Cola products. In fact, a majority of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats said that they were less likely to purchase Coca-Cola products. Most of us merely want corporations to focus their attention on developing superior products and services. But stay out of the culture wars and stop trying to be more woke than your competitors. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Gary Bauer, president of American Values. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You can give us a call. Of course, we'll be having an open line after Gary leaves, and certainly we'll take some more phone calls there as well. But Gary, one of the themes that I've been focusing on this year is the theme of discernment, because as you and I well know, you can't believe everything you see in the press or that you read on an internet website. And one of the reasons I posted this article by the Wall Street Journal is it started out by talking about the narrative following the familiar script. Hamas fires rockets as Israeli cities. Israel retaliates by bombing the source of those rockets in Gaza. Hamas plays up the civilian casualties, and the world pressures Israel to stop defending itself. And then they say, let's hope this isn't the trap the Biden administration falls into. I'd like to believe that, but I don't. And if nothing else, help us out, because you have so much outrage right now for Israel defending themselves. And I love that one of these individuals with the IDF made it very clear that he said, you know, all it would take, what did he say here, if one rocket were fired on Washington, I suspect that the mindset of what we're getting right now from the mainstream press and some of the people on the left would be very different, wouldn't it?
Well, it's a great point, and you know, that is a good thought process, I think, Kerby, for any American to do when they're judging how other countries are acting around the world, and particularly a country like Israel that lives in the middle of a really bad neighborhood with a number of countries like Iran and so forth that mean them harm. The analogy is perfect. We would not tolerate for an hour rockets coming in from Canada and Mexico and or off the shores from some island or whatever being fired at us by terrorists, whoever was president, we would demand that he or she deal with that threat immediately. And yet when it comes to the only Jewish nation in the world, the homeland of the Jews, there's this tendency to hold them to a different standard. There's another thing here, Kerby, that I think is important. I think people understand the rules of war just enough to be dangerous. They don't know the details. So one of the basic tenets of the rules of war is that a military force cannot hide its weapons and its soldiers among a civilian population. That is literally, and in law, in international law, that is a war crime. For obvious reasons, you're putting at risk the civilians and the places, it might be mosques and other places that you're hiding weapons. It's not only a war crime, but the enemy that you are attacking with the weapons that are hidden among the civilians, they have a free rein under international law to fire back, even if some civilians die. Because those civilian deaths that have resulted in that exchange are not the fault of the country defending itself. They're the fault of the entity, the military entity, that hid the weapons that are being fired among civilians. So all the shouting about, Israel's violating international law, they're a terrorist state, they must stop immediately, all of that is factually incorrect under international law. And then one other thing, Kerby, which I just find amazing, I've heard Congresswoman Tlaib Rashid, Congresswoman Omar saying, well, X number of Palestinians have died, but only X number of Israelis have died. It's not equitable, and Israel needs to stop. This is one of the most silly arguments I've ever heard. Because Israel is able to fight back effectively, somehow they're supposed to be penalized. And somehow the United States or the American people, according to these critics, should side with the Palestinian extremist groups that started the conflict when they started raining rockets into Israeli communities.
You were talking about the fact that, of course, they launch these rockets from the rooftops of places where there's civilians. Sometimes they hide rockets in schools and hospitals and all the rest. But the outrage that came over the weekend when, indeed, Israel decided to go after this one particular building in Gaza that not only hides and houses terrorists, but also reporters from Associated Press and Al Jazeera. Now, to be fair, Israel warned the journalists and others in the building to clear out, and they did, and of course also did the Hamas militants. And so, of course, as sad as it is that some of the journalistic offices were destroyed, no life was lost, but the outcry that's come from the press maybe would be, if you want to be safe, make sure that you aren't in a building where there are Hamas terrorists or Islamic jihadist terrorists. Is that a fair statement?
That is definitely a fair statement. And today a number of articles have come out suggesting that the Associated Press in that building were aware way back in 2011 and 2012 that Hamas was operating in a neighborhood, that Hamas had a presence in the building, and Hamas regularly threatened the Associated Press, and so the Associated Press didn't report any of this. Well, now there's consequences from all of that. By the way, the Associated Press is one of the most anti-Israel media outlets in the world, and these are crocodile tears that they're shedding now about what's happened to their offices in Gaza. You can't lie down with dogs without getting fleas, and that's exactly what the Associated Press did.
Well, next time you're on Al Jazeera, Associated Press, you can explain that to them. But one more thing I wanted to get to, because one of the other wonderful Gary Bauer greatest hits were the left versus Israel. And I thought it was interesting that you have an individual that is right now campaigning for the mayor race in New York. That would be Andrew Yang. Now, there's a lot about Andrew Yang that I like. I don't like his universal basic income and everything, but he's at least, I think, somebody you could talk to. And when he actually said something that wasn't really a strong defense about Israel, but at least it could be seen as defending Israel, oh my goodness, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others just came down on his head. And are we getting to a point now where just making obvious statements about who the aggressor is and what a sovereign nation must do to protect itself, if that is not even permitted today in this kind of wokeness that we have?
I think that's exactly what's happening, particularly if the country defending itself is a country, broadly speaking, that is aligned with the United States as we try to defend Western civilization. I mean, the United States and Israel are the two pillars of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. And we know that people like AOC think that civilization is evil and, quite frankly, don't want us to defend ourselves from enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah. You know, Kerby, I really want to I don't think I can put too fine of a point on this. Maybe some Americans are ambivalent about what's going on right now between Israel and Hamas. Many of us, like you and I, want to see Israel win this conflict. But here's something that I think concentrates the mind. We now have people in Congress, like AOC, like some of these other Congress people. Bernie Sanders, I would put in the same category. There are a lot of people on the left. They're growing in power. Also, people in the media. They are hoping and wishing that Hamas prevails. They want to see great harm come to the nation of Israel and to the Jewish people. And to think that there are ostensibly Americans that think that way should make us all wonder and worry about what's happening in our country.
Yeah, I'm holding up right now the booklet we did a while back on anti-Semitism. Gary, I've said we just gonna have to completely update it in light of all the things that have just been said, even over the last couple of months. But first of all, just before I let you go, I want to encourage people to click on your picture here on Point of View, or they can go directly to ouramericanvalues.org. We've been pulling some of the most significant quotes from the end of day reports last week by Gary Bauer. If you'd like to get the one coming out today and get ones in the future, you can sign up. And Gary, it's always great to have you on the program, and I'm encouraging some people to support your ministry and also to sign up for your end of day report.
Fantastic, Kerby. Thank you so much. And, of course, I hope it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Your work is irreplaceable, and I hope you prosper and that you continue to get the support you need from good folks around the country.
Well, we're going to take a break, and let's, if we can, take some of your phone calls. We, by the way, got calls today from Georgia and South Carolina. Do you know that later this week I'm going to be doing a live broadcast from our station in South Carolina and also a broadcast from our network in Georgia? So I'll look forward to getting a chance to meet some of you face to face. So let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Thought I'd just mention that my commentary today is called Woke Corporations. It was on the website. It is not there now. I know we've been having some trouble with the website, so maybe it'll be up there later, but I just wanted you to know that it's there, and it certainly attempts to help us understand that many of these CEOs of some of these major corporations do not realize the negative publicity that is being generated by this idea of trying to be more woke than their competitors. I hear this phrase so often, and I just alluded to the fact that later this week, we're doing a live broadcast from our radio station in South Carolina. Looking forward to seeing many of you in South Carolina if you're going to be in an event that we've already invited you to. Matter of fact, I think we actually had to turn people away because we have such response. And then we'll also be doing Friday from Augusta, Georgia, and so I think we still have lots of room there, so we'll talk about that. But anyway, when you travel around, you hear this phrase all the time, get woke, go broke. And I've mentioned before some of these major companies that have decided that they would simply kind of buy into wokeness, and it hasn't worked so well for them in terms of the bottom line. And in my commentary, I just point out that there are all sorts of individuals that have been raising these questions. Senator Rick Scott, who is a senator from Florida, wrote an open letter to woke corporate America and talked about, you must just really love the accolades from moving the all-star game from Georgia and honoring the all-time record holder for the most number of home runs, Hank Aaron, to Colorado, where it makes no sense at all, and destroyed all these jobs. And then I quote another senator, and that's Ted Cruz, who's the senator from Texas, who actually has been fairly criticized for some of the things he said, which the point I'm making is you can't say you didn't know all this, because some of this has certainly been able to get national attention. But nevertheless, what I thought was so striking is to look at the latest Rasmussen poll, and this one just has to do with Coca-Cola, but I can multiply that by other products. But the one that came out by Rasmussen the other day found that a majority of Americans who are Republican and a quarter of Americans who are Democrats said that they were less likely to purchase Coca-Cola products simply because of the criticism that they made over the what I think were basically voter integrity laws passed in the state of Georgia. Well, this is multiplying around the country, where there are various groups and corporations and businesses speaking out against trying to have just what I think are some reasonable sets of rules having to do with the election, but also now saying that we will not actually hold an event in your city or state if you for example, ban transgender girls. That would be a boy who now says that I'm a girl, from competing against other female athletes. And, the list is getting longer and longer. And the sad reality is it's also, in some respects, going to affect more and more of these businesses and corporations. And I think that an individual who's a CEO has a right to speak out on those issues. Not saying that they don't have a free speech right. They certainly do. But when you're trying to mobilize the entire corporation, you should really be dedicated to trying to produce superior products and services. And if I can give you some advice, stay out of the culture wars. First of all, it doesn't do you any good. There are a lot of people that are reacting to it in the first place. And second of all, the bigger issue, which is certainly an issue that we need to talk about, is sometimes I think you're just on the wrong side of an issue that you've never really thoroughly investigated. And that was certainly illustrated by the case when Lieutenant Governor here in the state of Texas asked the head of one of the major airlines, why did you sign this letter condemning what we were doing in the Texas Senate? And the CEO kind of sheepishly acknowledged, well, I never looked at the law. I just signed it because everybody else wanted me to sign it. Is that the way we're running major corporations in America? Like something that looks like a junior high school popularity contest? Come on, everybody sign the petition. That's kind of where we're going, and it's a sad commentary and a reason why, if indeed you have very concrete, very substantial suggestions about what should be changed in a piece of law, great. but just hopping onto the wokeness train is not necessarily helpful to you or to the country. But let's move on, because one of the other articles that I've posted, which we really didn't get to, is by an individual that I've always enjoyed. Whenever I've met him face to face and whenever I interviewed him, we've always loved Dr. Ben Carson. And this is a piece that goes on for 3 pages on the issue of inflation. And he says, America's fiscal house is not in order. The government spends trillions more than it takes in every year. He goes on to say, for decades, politicians have been more concerned with making speeches and raiding the Treasury than sound economics and fiscal responsibility. He points out that, for example, in the last decade, the level of federal debt held by the public increased more than 400%. We went from $5 trillion as a national debt to $22 trillion, and now, of course, we're up to about 28, but I'll just leave the numbers there. And then he reminds us that federal spending exceeded $8.5 trillion each of the past 4 quarters, and twice it exceeded $10 trillion in a quarter. So if nothing else, this is a very disturbing trend that needs to be actually affected in a very short order. And I don't see any evidence that this administration is wanting to cut back. If anything, it wants to double down on even spending more money. And then the Federal Reserve, what can they do? I mean, they try to issue treasuries, but nobody's buying them. People say, well, China we owe a lot to China. China holds us in debt. Yeah, they got about $1 trillion in debt. Japan, about $1 trillion of our debt. UK, about a little less than $1 trillion. That's it. I mean, most of it is where we issue treasuries. Nobody buys them, so the Federal Reserve buys them by printing more money. It's a sad commentary indeed. So anyway, later in the article, Dr. Ben Carson says inflation is on the rise. The measure of inflation, called Core Consumer Price Index, increased to its highest level in 13 years to 4%. You have, if you've been listening to this program, know, and I've got a commentary coming out on, actually tomorrow. Is that when it's coming out tomorrow? Yes, it is indeed. So tomorrow's commentary is on the issue of inflation. And I point out that if you look at the actual numbers, both on Tuesday and Wednesday's commentary, I point out that those numbers are actually artificially low because of the way we actually do what's called the Consumer Price Index. But anyway, even the highest inflation rate in 13 years should get your attention. And certainly it's an increase of 2.6%, which is the highest level since 2018. So again, he points out we're still the present and coming inflation will, and this is the key issue that Dr. Carson is talking about, will disproportionately harm the poorest among us. You might remember, if you were with us on Friday, one of the things that Lathan Watts said, and I appreciate him saying it because I agree with it, is that when you have inflation, the people that are hurt are the people who don't add and have appreciating assets. These are the individuals that live paycheck to paycheck and hand to mouth, or whatever phrase you want to use, because inflation erodes the purchasing power, and individuals with lower incomes, he says, and lower wealth rarely benefit from the upsides of inflation, such as wage growth, which is less likely to accrue to be productive because lower skilled, lower wage workers don't face that, and they don't own equity or asset prices that appreciate over time, and low interest rates and rising price levels generally erode the purchasing power and wealth of households and harm those who save small amounts, since interest rates are effectively outstripped by inflation. Dr. Ben Carson, you may have your degrees in medicine, but I'd give you an A in Economics 101 anytime, because it's a very well-written piece. And again, I have another article that we posted the other day called Inflation is the Issue That Will Topple the Democrats. It was one we had on Friday, which we never got to. Let me just read one quick thing before we take a break. In the middle section, it talks about how the Bureau of Labor Statistics basically show that there's a 5% annualized rate of increase in the cost of shelter. By the way, I will point out tomorrow in my commentary that sometimes that's up by 15% in some particular areas. Housing gasoline prices are rising by 12%. That's closer to the actual. And then the whole issue of used car prices are increasing dramatically because there's a shortage of chips, semiconductors, and the wholesale price of used cars rose 20% because we're not producing enough new cars. So you can see that we are in a time of inflation, and this should cause some real concern. So when we come back from the break, I'll give you just a couple other facts and figures on that, and just a couple other closing comments. But if you'd like to join us, of course, the phones are open, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention real quickly that I know people tune in and tune out, and so you don't have a chance to hear the entire program. And at the top of the hour, last hour, I did talk about the fact that our first article is about the COVID origins in a Chinese lab. Of course, that would be in the Wuhan Institute for Virology. And if you would like to read that, a very good piece that we have posted. The second one, which has the title, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and Biden, is a very good piece that came out of the Wall Street Journal. And, of course, in addition to that, I do want to also direct you to some really good material that is available at Gary Bauer's End of Day Report. And then just a minute ago, I was quoting from a very good editorial op-ed by Dr. Ben Carson on the whole issue of inflation. I called it Biden's inflation crisis. And I did just a minute ago talk about the commentary for today, but also wanted to give you a preview for the rest of this week, because tomorrow my commentary is entitled Little Inflation ? And the reason I bring that up is because the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that would be Jerome Powell, actually doesn't think inflation's a big deal. Matter of fact, the other day in testimony, he said, inflation's not a problem for this time. As near as I can figure, right now, M2 does not really have important implications. Now, I know most of you don't spend a lot of time in economics, so let me just convene a very short Economics 101 course. When he's talking about M2, he's talking about what's called the M2 money supply. Now, I am sure that Karen, when she posts this tomorrow, will have the link to a graph that I like to encourage you to look at. The M2 money supply measures the amount of cash, checks, money market, mutual funds. It really basically how many dollars we got running out there. And but you don't even have to find the link. You could go right now to your Google, type in M2 money stock on a computer, and you'll notice two things. First of all, you'll notice that ever since about 2008, the money supply is increasing kind of more significantly. And then when you get to 2020, the amount of money just shoots almost vertical. And so that's the first thing you'll notice. Whoa, okay, first of all, we are just printing much more in terms of U.S. dollars than ever before. The other thing you'll notice about the graph is it says discontinued. Why is that? Well, they used to update it every week, and they've given up even trying to keep track of the money supply, which should tell you everything. I think they do have another one which is updated monthly, but the fact that they're printing so much money should really cause you to be concerned about that. And so, if nothing else, that's one of the reasons why I've said we have much more inflation than you might think. And that's due to the fact that what is used to measure inflation is what's called the Consumer Price Index. Well, I've written about this before, and then I went back and looked, and I said, yeah, the last time I wrote about the Consumer Price Index and the fact that it's not an accurate measure of inflation, I wrote about that on May 12th, 2011. Okay, that was 10 years ago, so I thought we needed an update. Well, that's Wednesday's commentary, which I'll get to in just a minute. And before I get to that, let me just mention that this Consumer Price Index measures some things, but not other things. For example, it doesn't measure lumber. And guess what? The cost of lumber, it's increased 180%, or some people say 280%. It depends on which baseline you use. But the National Association of Home Builders the other day said that the increased cost in lumber alone adds an additional $35,000, almost $36,000 to the average home in America being built. So you can see, yes, we got some inflation. In this commentary, I also talk about if you look at the home value index, the Zillow Home Value Index for Austin, 15%, almost 16%. Los Angeles, 9.5%. Denver, 7.8%. Seattle, 7.5%. You get the idea. You know that because if you go to the grocery store or you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, you already figured out that the prices are going up precipitously. And that brings us real quickly, and then I'll end with that the Consumer Price Index has been changed many times over time. And one of the more significant times it was changed is in 1980. So I have a link there to Shadow Stats, which helps you understand that if we still use the same Consumer Price Index that we used back in 1980, we wouldn't be talking about an increase of the Consumer Price Index of 4%, or basically inflation of 4%. We we'd be talking about one at about 12%. So again, let's just recognize that the cost of home value is going up, the cost of higher education is going up, the cost of corn has gone up dramatically, and just all sorts of other things that we can talk about. And we'll certainly try to talk about some of that as we go through this week. And if nothing else, certainly try to focus a little more time and attention on it later in the week as we're doing some broadcasts from South Carolina and Georgia, both in Thursday and Friday, respectively. But just before we wind down today, I thought I would share a piece that came from Peter Van Buren. Don't know much about him, although I've seen some of the books he's written, but he talks about the other virus, learned helplessness. Now, if you are not familiar with that, if you've ever taken a class in psychology, you might have heard of this idea of learned helplessness. It was coined back in the 1960s by Martin Sigelman and Stephen Meyer. And now, I hate to say this, but the study actually involved giving electric shocks to dogs. Yeah, I know. I don't agree with that at all. But nevertheless, they found that if they would shock a dog and there was a way for the dog to escape, of course, the dog would run away. But if they put a barrier there and they shocked the dog, after a couple of times, the dog would recognize, oh, I can't get out, so they just put up with the shocks. And then even when they'd lift the barrier, the dog wouldn't leave. And that's a way of simply saying that sometimes what happens is that we can be so programmed, almost like a Pavlovian response, if you will, that then we've learned helplessness. And he says, you know, if you think about this, why would any American allow the government to deny him a final goodbye to the person who raised him? Why would anyone allow grandma to die untouched in a hospital room without fighting back? In the post-vaccination era, why do people not remove their mask? Because he says it gets into this issue of learned helplessness. And he even points out that we've had enablers of learned helplessness, because later on in his article, he says we have enforcers for what's called learned helplessness. He says suddenly your waitress transitions from someone serving you into someone who orders you to wear a mask, sit alone, or eat outside. Flight attendants, more from delivering drinks to holding the power to have security haul you to jail for unmasking when you're not actively eating. Companies once run by entrepreneurs are now totally controlled by harassment stalking undead, he says, from HR. We become a republic of hall monitors, and there it is, wrong people are in charge. Anyway, he goes through lots of stories that just remind us that we've almost sort of become accustomed to what he calls learned helplessness. And so I've been thinking about maybe there is a possible commentary there when you go back and look at how this has been documented. When we see that a person gets put in a place where he or she faces negative, uncontrolled situations and then eventually gives up trying to improve their or her circumstances, even when you have the ability to do so. And I thought it was a striking commentary on how some of this pandemic, the lockdown, and the mandates have affected behavior in some very unfortunate ways. Well, if nothing else, we will leave some of those conversations to later in the week, but I just thought I'd end by adding another phrase, learned helplessness. Very interesting psychological term developed during the 1960s, and we certainly have seen examples of that manifesting itself today in the world around us. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about, we've had Kerby Bauer on the program, we've had Lila Rose on the program. You'll find all of that on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, Consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.